In the spring of 1986, Tacoma, Washington, looked like the picture of calm. It was a city framed by mountains and water, a place where families felt safe letting their children play in the park, where the sound of bicycles and laughter carried through the air like a promise that nothing terrible could happen here. But sometimes, darkness hides behind familiar streets. Sometimes evil waits where it's least expected. This is the Cold Case Archive. If you're drawn to stories where justice takes decades to find its voice, where DNA whispers truths long after the world has stopped listening, then you're in the right place. Subscribe and step with us into the past, where answers are never as simple as they seem. April 29, 1986. The sun rose gently over Tacoma, spilling soft light across the lawns and cul-de-sacs of North 30th Street. At 12 years old, Michella Welch was the kind of girl every parent wanted their child to be: responsible, intelligent, kind-hearted. The eldest of 3 sisters, she loved reading, loved riding her bike, and had a gentle maturity that often made her seem older than she was. That morning she packed lunch for herself and her sisters: sandwiches, fruit, and cookies wrapped neatly in wax paper, and together they rode their bikes to Puget Park, a quiet green stretch near the gulch where kids often played after school. The park wasn't empty, but it wasn't crowded either. It was the kind of warm, early spring day when the world felt open and harmless. The trees were beginning to bloom, the creek below trickled softly, and the scent of wet earth mixed with cut grass. The girls dropped their bikes near a picnic table and began to play. Michella, ever the caretaker, decided to ride back home to grab sandwiches they'd forgotten. She told her sister she'd be right back. It was a short ride, barely 10 minutes each way. She never came back. When her sisters realized how long she'd been gone, they went searching. They called her name into the trees, voices echoing down the gulch. A few park-goers helped, and before long, police were notified. Hours passed. The daylight began to dim. The laughter that had filled the park earlier was replaced by the muffled hum of police radios, the crunch of boots on leaves, and the rising dread that something was terribly wrong. That night, search teams scoured the park. Flashlights flickered through the trees. Volunteers, officers, and neighbors called out her name, their words breaking through the still air. But there was no answer. By morning, hope began to turn into something colder, a quiet, heavy fear that seemed to hang over the entire neighborhood. Late the next day, the search ended in heartbreak. Michella's body was found in a wooded area near the gulch, hidden not far from where she'd last been seen. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The innocence of Tacoma's quiet spring was shattered in an instant. The crime scene was methodically examined, but this was 1986, decades before modern DNA databases or forensic breakthroughs that could instantly connect a name to a crime. Investigators collected what they could: fibers, hair, fingerprints, and biological material that would be sealed away for testing that technology hadn't yet caught up to. Back then, DNA profiling was in its infancy. The FBI had only just begun experimenting with techniques that compared genetic barcodes, but these methods were slow, limited, and often inconclusive. For the detectives of Tacoma, it felt like chasing a shadow. Leads came in, interviews were conducted, suspects questioned, but every path went cold. For Michella's family, life split into 2 parts: before that April day and after. Her mother, Sandra, spoke softly in interviews about her daughter's kindness, her love of animals, her gentle smile. Her sisters carried the weight of that afternoon for the rest of their lives: the guilt, the memory, the sound of her laughter disappearing down the path. The local papers filled with headlines: "Child murder stuns North End," "Community grieves for Michella." The people of Tacoma were afraid. Parks once filled with children now sat empty. Parents kept their kids close. The police increased patrols, warning residents to stay vigilant. They didn't know that just months later, tragedy would strike again, in a park barely 5 miles away. Detectives worked tirelessly in those first weeks, but they were running on instinct and pressure. There was no clear suspect, no eyewitness who could describe who had been near Michella that day. The case drew in veteran investigators, including members of the Tacoma Police's Major Crimes Unit. They built timelines, mapped Michella's route, even brought in bloodhounds to track her scent. Nothing broke the silence. And so the case entered the archives, a stack of reports, photographs, and evidence envelopes stored in temperature-controlled rooms, labeled and numbered but never forgotten. Over the years, detectives would reopen the file, test a new theory, pursue a new name, and hit the same wall. Time marched on. The park grew quieter, the playground equipment changed, but the wound it carried never healed. By the early 1990s, the memory of Michella's case lingered like fog, always there, hovering over the community, but never clear enough to grasp. It became one of those stories whispered among parents to warn their children. Don't go too far, don't go alone. Then came August 4, 1986, just 3 months after Michella's murder. Another young girl, Jennifer Bastian, went missing while riding her bike in Point Defiance Park, one of Tacoma's largest recreation areas. She was 13, bright, athletic, with dreams of joining her school's swim team. Her disappearance sent shockwaves through the city. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Both girls were young. Both loved biking. Both disappeared in daylight in public parks just miles apart. To the people of Tacoma, it felt like deja vu, a nightmare repeating itself. For investigators, it became the most urgent manhunt the city had ever seen. As the second search began, mothers stood at their windows, clutching their children tighter. The city that once felt open now felt like a maze of danger and memory. News crews swarmed, helicopters circled, and the faces of Michella and Jennifer appeared side by side on posters, taped to lampposts and pinned in grocery stores. What kind of person could do this, twice? For Michella's family, the grief deepened. For Jennifer's, the fear was unbearable. Both families prayed for a miracle, for an answer, for a name. But those answers would take over 3 decades to arrive. In the years that followed, the world changed, DNA technology evolved, computer databases expanded, and cold case units began revisiting evidence once thought useless. Yet even with each leap forward, Michella's killer remained faceless. The DNA collected in 1986 sat frozen, preserved in a small vial, waiting for science to catch up. Detectives retired. New ones took their place. Each generation of officers felt the same weight. 2 girls, 2 parks, 2 families broken, and 1 city still haunted. Sometimes, in interviews, investigators admitted they still visited the parks. They'd walk the paths where Michella once rode, look toward the woods, and wonder what they'd missed. It wasn't just a case, it was a promise unfulfilled. 30 years is a long time for a community to hold its breath. By the time 2018 arrived, Tacoma had changed beyond recognition, but the ache remained. The old case files were pulled once more, their pages yellowed, photographs fading. And that tiny fragment of evidence from 1986, that strand of DNA, was about to speak louder than anyone could have imagined. The past was waking up. And somewhere, hidden in the data of a genealogy website, the truth was finally stirring. The air in Tacoma that August felt heavier somehow, as if the city itself remembered. Parents kept their children closer, windows stayed locked at night, and every bicycle left alone on a sidewalk carried an unspoken unease. It had been barely 3 months since the murder of 12-year-old Michella Welch, and though time had passed, the wound was still open. People whispered her name when they saw patrol cars drive by. They still left flowers near Puget Park. On August 4, 1986, the cycle began again. 13-year-old Jennifer Bastian woke up that Monday morning filled with the kind of excitement only summer brings. She was an energetic, athletic girl. Blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, bright eyes always moving. Her parents, Ralph and Patty Bastian, described her as determined and full of life. She loved swimming, loved her bike, and loved testing herself against the world. That morning, she was planning one more training ride before an upcoming race. Jennifer had been looking forward to it for days. A ride through Point Defiance Park, the largest green space in Tacoma. The park sprawled across 700 acres, filled with forest trails, steep roads, and sweeping views of the Puget Sound. Families picnicked there, joggers followed the 5-mile drive loop, and cyclists treated it as their own private course. For a girl like Jennifer, it was freedom on 2 wheels. Before leaving, she promised her mother she wouldn't go far, that she'd be home before dinner. She strapped on her small yellow backpack, hopped on her white Schwinn bicycle, and pedaled down the street under the bright summer sun. It was a little after 2 p.m. No one knew that would be the last time anyone saw her alive. Around 3:30 that afternoon, a jogger near 5 Mile Drive noticed a young girl on a bicycle. She waved as he passed. Later he would tell police he thought nothing of it at the time, just another kid enjoying the park. That small, fleeting moment would become the final confirmed sighting of Jennifer Bastian. By 6 p.m., when Jennifer hadn't returned, her parents began to worry. They called friends, checked nearby routes, and then called the police. Officers responded quickly. After Michella's case just months earlier, any report of a missing child triggered an immediate reaction. Within hours, Point Defiance Park was swarming with officers, volunteers, and park rangers. Helicopters circled overhead. Flashlights swept the wooded trails as the sun sank behind the trees. The search continued through the night. People came from all over Tacoma to help. They combed through ravines, lifted fallen branches, checked restrooms, and waded through the underbrush. Jennifer's father refused to leave. He stayed in the park, flashlight in hand, long after others went home. But nothing was found. By morning, reporters gathered outside the park entrance. The city's worst fear had returned. The parallels to Michella Welch's case were impossible to ignore. Another young girl, another bicycle, another disappearance in a Tacoma park. Was it the same person? Could the same predator have returned, confident, unseen, unstoppable? Detectives from both investigations met that morning at the police station. They compared notes, maps, and photographs. The similarities were chilling. Two girls roughly the same age, both last seen in daylight, both vanishing in wooded areas within a few miles of each other. The working theory was simple but terrifying. Tacoma might have a serial predator. The community's panic deepened. Parents refused to let their children outside. The local newspaper, the News Tribune, printed warnings in bold type. Police cars patrolled the parks day and night. Rumors spread faster than facts. As days passed without results, detectives followed every lead they could. Witnesses claimed they'd seen a suspicious man near the park. Descriptions varied wildly. A jogger, a man with a beard, a tan van parked by the trails. Each tip led to another dead end. They interviewed dozens of registered sex offenders, drifters, even former military personnel stationed nearby. But still no Jennifer. Her parents appeared on local news broadcasts, pleading for her safe return. "Please," her mother said softly through tears, "if someone has her, let her come home." Those words echoed across Tacoma, a desperate appeal that reached every living room, every diner, every classroom. For 24 days the search went on. Then, on August 28, 1986, a jogger cutting through a wooded trail inside Point Defiance Park noticed something unusual: the curved edge of a bicycle tire glinting under leaves near a drainage area. He looked closer, and what he saw sent him running toward the nearest phone. Police arrived quickly. The scene they found was heartbreakingly familiar. Jennifer's body lay in a secluded patch of woods, hidden just off the trail. Like Michella, she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her white Schwinn was found close by, rusted from rain and time. Detectives stood in silence, staring at the ground, unable to ignore the echoes of the past spring. The killer had struck again, and he had done it in the same city, under the same sun. The discovery crushed Tacoma. It wasn't just another tragedy, it was confirmation of the nightmare everyone had feared. Two girls, gone in the same summer, killed in almost identical ways. It didn't seem possible that someone could hide in plain sight like that. Someone who knew the parks, who knew where to disappear. For investigators, the pressure was unbearable. The FBI was called in to assist. Profiles were developed, psychological patterns analyzed. The media dubbed the cases the Tacoma Park murders. Early forensic testing suggested the cases were connected, but not conclusively. Both contained biological evidence, but in 1986, that kind of material could only be examined through RFLP testing, a primitive form of DNA analysis that required large, clean samples and could take weeks to produce partial results. Those tests were laborious and often consumed precious evidence in the process. Still, scientists worked with what they had. The results came back inconclusive. There wasn't enough data to confirm the same perpetrator, but the similarities were too striking to dismiss. Police circulated composite sketches, created from the few vague witness statements they had. A man in his 20s, maybe early 30s, athletic build, possibly riding a motorcycle. But every lead fizzled out. The two murders had frozen the heart of Tacoma. Children's laughter disappeared from the parks, replaced by patrol cars and yellow tape. People began locking doors in broad daylight. The idea of safety itself seemed to have vanished. Investigators chased hundreds of tips. One lead involved a man seen watching children near a different park that summer. Another pointed to a drifter passing through town. Every suspect was questioned, fingerprinted, and cleared. Forensic testing yielded nothing definitive. Without the technology of the future, detectives were trying to piece together a puzzle in the dark. Years began to pass. One by one, the original investigators retired. The case files grew thicker, new detectives inherited the unsolved murders, and each generation promised to bring fresh eyes. They compared the crime scene photos, 2 young girls, 2 parks, same summer, same horror, and swore they would never let the cases fade away. The families grieved quietly. The Bastian home became a shrine of memories. Framed photos, trophies, Jennifer's ribbons, her school notebooks still stacked neatly on her desk. Michella's mother would later say that every time she heard news of another unsolved case, it reopened the wound. Tacoma's collective trauma lingered like a shadow that never lifted. Parents who had once been children in 1986 grew up, had children of their own, and told them stories about the 2 girls who never came home. In the police archives, the 2 cases sat side by side, their files marked with the same handwritten note. Unsolved, related? But inside the evidence lockers, sealed carefully in envelopes and vials, lay the key to everything. Microscopic fragments of truth that science had not yet learned how to read. Then came the 1990s, and with it, the birth of DNA profiling as a criminal tool. Laboratories began retesting samples from old cases, including Michella's and Jennifer's. In 1999, Tacoma police sent their evidence to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab for comparison. This time, the results were clearer. The 2 samples did not match. The relief was mixed with confusion. It meant the unthinkable, that 2 separate predators had struck in the same city just months apart. That revelation reshaped everything investigators thought they knew. For years, both families had lived under the shared horror of believing the same man had killed their daughters. Now they had to face a different, equally haunting truth. 2 monsters had walked among them that summer. The discovery changed how the cases were handled. Detectives split their efforts. One team focused on Michella Welch's file, another on Jennifer Bastian's. They both shared information, but each now hunted a different ghost. For the public, the distinction didn't matter. The pain was the same. For Tacoma, it meant the summer of 1986 was doubly cursed. 2 children, 2 killers, and decades of silence to follow. As time wore on, the faces of Michella and Jennifer remained on bulletin boards inside the police department, yellowed edges but never removed. Retired officers still stopped by to ask if there was any progress. Reporters occasionally revisited the cases, each story ending with the same line: authorities continued to seek answers. But science wasn't finished. The world was on the edge of a revolution, one that would allow investigators to reach into the past and find names hidden within strands of DNA. And somewhere in a freezer in Tacoma, the evidence from 1986 waited patiently for the day when technology would finally be ready to listen. The city had lived in fear long enough. Justice was still silent, but not for much longer. For decades, Tacoma lived in the shadow of 1986. The years rolled by, the city changed, and yet the memory of 2 young girls lost to violence remained frozen in time, a scar that never quite healed. Detectives who had once walked those parks in uniform grew older, retired, and handed off the case files to younger investigators who hadn't even been alive when Michella Welch and Jennifer Bastian were murdered. Each new detective inherited the same promise: don't let these girls be forgotten. Inside the Tacoma Police Department's cold case unit, 2 thick binders sat side by side on a metal shelf, one labeled Welch, Michella, 1986, the other Bastian, Jennifer, 1986. The corners were frayed, the pages yellowed. But the evidence within, swabs, fibers, and photographs, was carefully preserved. It was all they had left. By the mid-1990s, DNA had changed everything. What once took months could now be done in days, and results were more precise than ever. But even with that leap forward, Tacoma's detectives still faced a cruel reality. While both cases contained DNA, no matches appeared in Cody's, the national DNA database established in 1998. The killer's genetic fingerprints were there, but they belonged to ghosts. Families kept waiting. For Michella's mother, time moved differently. She visited her daughter's grave often, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to sit in silence. For the Bastian family, life had fractured into 2 timelines, before August 1986 and after. Jennifer's room remained nearly untouched. Her trophies, her ribbons, her bicycle helmet, All still there, all still waiting for her return. Investigators continued retesting evidence as new methods became available. By 2003, the Welch sample was successfully refined using STR, short tandem repeat analysis, a more advanced form of DNA profiling. The profile was clear, viable, and complete. But again, no match. It became a grim ritual. Every few years, detectives would resubmit the profiles, hoping technology had caught up or that the perpetrator had finally entered the system through another crime. But each time the results came back the same. No hit found. Forensic science was evolving, but justice remained out of reach. Meanwhile, Tacoma itself grew around the memory of those two girls. Parks were renovated, neighborhoods expanded, and yet locals still remembered. Whenever another tragedy made headlines, the names Michella Welch and Jennifer Bastian resurfaced, whispered reminders that evil could hide anywhere. Detective Lindsay Wade, who joined Tacoma PD in the 1990s and later became one of its leading cold case investigators, carried the files with her like sacred texts. She refused to let them gather dust. In interviews years later, she would describe feeling a personal connection to both girls. They were close to her own age when they died, and she'd grown up in the same city, walking the same trails, riding the same kind of bike. By the late 2000s, she'd made it her mission to re-examine every unsolved murder in the department's archives. And at the top of her list were the two names that haunted Tacoma's history. Wade often spoke of those cases as the ones that wouldn't let go. Every time she reopened them, something new seemed to whisper from the pages. A forgotten report, a detail in the autopsy, a name in the witness list. In 2013, she reached out to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab to see if newer DNA recovery methods could help extract more detail from the 1986 samples. The lab confirmed both profiles were still intact, remarkably well preserved considering their age. That confirmation reignited hope. The Welch and Bastian families were contacted once again. They had grown used to these updates, cautious not to let hope swell too high. But this time things felt different. Technology had taken another leap. A new method of familial DNA searching had started to prove its worth across the country. In California, it had led to arrests in cold cases once thought unsolvable. And by 2018, something even more revolutionary was changing the world of forensics. Genetic genealogy, a process that used open-source databases like GEDmatch to trace DNA to distant relatives. It was the same method that identified the Golden State Killer that same year. Detective Wade immediately saw the potential. If the killers of Michella and Jennifer had any living relatives who had submitted their DNA to one of those genealogy sites, the new tools could build a family tree from the crime scene samples, branch by branch until it led to a name. In early 2018, both cases were submitted for forensic genealogy analysis. The first breakthrough came from Michella Welch's evidence. Within weeks, genealogists identified distant relatives of the unknown DNA contributor. As they built out the family tree, one name began to emerge from the branches: Gary Charles Hartman, a nurse working at Western State Hospital in Lakewood, Washington. Hartman was 66 years old, polite, soft-spoken, with no criminal record. But back in 1986, he had lived near the area and fit the general description from witnesses at the time. Police began covert surveillance. They followed him to work, to restaurants, to gas stations, waiting for an opportunity to collect a discarded DNA sample. Then, in May 2018, investigators retrieved a paper napkin Hartman had thrown away at a coffee shop. It was carefully bagged and rushed to the lab. When the results came back, the DNA matched the sample from Michella Welch's crime scene. After 32 years, the first name was finally known. When officers arrived at Hartman's home to arrest him, neighbors watched in shock. The man they knew as quiet and kind, a longtime resident who played classical music in his car, was now accused of one of Tacoma's darkest crimes. But the victory was bittersweet. The arrest solved one half of Tacoma's nightmare. The other half, Jennifer Bastian's murder, was still waiting. That same summer, genealogical testing for the Bastian case continued. At first, progress was slow. The DNA sample had degraded slightly over time, and the genealogists had to work through several distant relatives to narrow the field. By August 2018, they had identified a family tree leading to two brothers, both from Tacoma, both around the same age, both potential suspects. Investigators obtained discarded DNA from each. When the results came back, one of them matched. His name was Robert Washburn, a 60-year-old former Tacoma resident living quietly in Illinois. Like Hartman, he had never been on law enforcement's radar in recent years. But back in 1986, he'd lived only a few miles from Point Defiance Park, the very place Jennifer disappeared. In fact, records showed he had even contacted police in the months after her murder, offering vague information about suspicious activity. His name had been logged, questioned, and then forgotten. Detectives flew to Illinois. In an early morning operation, Washburn was arrested without incident. When confronted with the DNA evidence, he said little. The news hit Tacoma like thunder. Within the span of just a few months, both of the city's most haunting cold cases were solved, by science, persistence, and the power of DNA. For the families, it was both devastating and healing. Jennifer's mother described it as a hole being closed but the ache still there. Michella's sister said it felt like finally exhaling after holding her breath for 30 years. Detective Wade, who had carried those files for most of her career, stood before reporters with quiet resolve. "These cases," she said, "show what happens when you don't give up, when you believe that time doesn't erase truth." As for Hartman and Washburn, both were charged with first-degree murder. Washburn was extradited from Illinois to Washington and later convicted. Hartman's case, however, remains pending as of 2025. Following multiple competency hearings, he has yet to stand trial. His name continues to symbolize how long and complex justice can be, even after truth is uncovered. Tacoma finally had names, faces, and justice, after more than 3 decades of silence. And perhaps most haunting of all, the killers had never crossed paths. 2 men, 2 parks, 2 victims. 1 city forever changed. In the end, it wasn't luck or confession that solved the mystery. It was technology, and the relentless will of investigators who refused to let 2 young girls become just names on a shelf. Today, if you walk through Puget Park or Point Defiance, you'll see signs of life again: joggers, cyclists, children laughing. But beneath the whisper of leaves and the hum of tires on pavement, the memory remains. The city never forgot, and neither did justice. But behind the headlines and the handcuffs lay the deeper story, how a strand of DNA, a family tree, and the resilience of memory finally converged to deliver truth. The arrests of Gary Hartman and Robert Washburn in 2018 sent shockwaves through Tacoma, a city that had long carried the weight of 2 unsolved murders, now confronted with the reality that the men responsible had been living ordinary lives among them all along. For 32 years, the question of who had taken Michella Welch and Jennifer Bastian had haunted detectives, families, and a generation of residents who had grown up fearing the same parks that once represented innocence. And now, as their names filled headlines once more, Tacoma found itself caught between relief and disbelief. Gary Hartman had worked as a nurse at Western State Hospital, a state-run psychiatric facility known for its secure wards and long-term patients. He was 66 years old at the time of his arrest. Clean record, steady job, polite demeanor. To those who knew him, the accusation felt surreal. But inside the Tacoma Police Department, the reaction was one of quiet vindication. For the cold case unit, it wasn't triumph. It was the echo of decades of unanswered calls finally meeting their reply. Forensic genealogy had done what persistence alone could not. It had given Michella her voice back. In the early days following his arrest, investigators revisited every aspect of the Welch case. Hartman had lived less than 3 miles from Puget Park in 1986. He was familiar with the area, often drove through the neighborhoods, and was known to frequent local trails. Witnesses from that time had recalled seeing a man matching his general build in the park that day, but there had never been enough to go on. Back then, DNA profiling was in its infancy. The evidence existed, but the technology to interpret it did not. Now, 3 decades later, a single napkin discarded in 2018 connected him irrevocably to a 12-year-old girl's final moments in the summer of 1986. As the news spread, reporters gathered outside the courthouse, the same steps where countless appeals for help had been made over the years. Photographs of Michella, bright smile, freckles, ponytail, appeared once again in newspapers and on television. To many, her face was frozen in 1986, a symbol of innocence stolen too soon. Detective Lindsay Wade stood before the cameras, composed yet emotional. "This case has been with us for so long," she said. "The science finally caught up with the truth. But the heart of this story isn't about DNA. It's about a community that refused to forget. The Welch family remained private, issuing only a brief statement thanking law enforcement for their persistence and asking for privacy. They had endured decades of false leads, anonymous tips, and quiet anniversaries. Now, closure had finally arrived, though it came wrapped in grief all over again. Meanwhile, the team working on Jennifer Bastian's case continued their pursuit across state lines. When Robert Washburn was identified through genetic genealogy, detectives were stunned by the parallels between him and Hartman. Two men with no known connection, living in the same city, preying on young girls within months of each other, yet their paths never crossed. It was coincidence so grim it bordered on the impossible. Washburn, like Hartman, had lived near the parks. He was known locally as a quiet, somewhat reclusive man, and in the years after Jennifer's murder, he'd moved out of state to Illinois. What few people remembered was that he had once volunteered limited information to police, not as a suspect but as a concerned citizen. He had called in a tip, referencing odd behavior in the area. His name was noted but dismissed. 4 years, that tip sat buried in the case file, a forgotten piece of the puzzle that only gained significance decades later when DNA revealed the truth. In May 2018, detectives from Tacoma flew to Illinois. Washburn was living alone in a modest apartment complex. When they knocked on his door, he opened it calmly. He did not resist. He seemed to understand why they were there before they even spoke. Back in Tacoma, the news broke within hours. Second arrest in 1986 girl's murder, the headlines read. The impossible had happened twice. 2 cold cases solved in 1 year in the same city, both through the power of genetic genealogy. The media called it the Tacoma breakthrough. In court, both men appeared in stark contrast to the images of the children whose lives they had taken. Hartman, gray-haired and bespectacled, sat quietly as charges were read. Washburn, stoic and pale, said little, his hands trembling slightly as he signed paperwork. For the families, these moments were excruciating, but also necessary. It was no longer a question of who. It was now about accountability. As the cases unfolded, the science behind them became a point of fascination. Forensic genealogy had built family trees from distant DNA matches, sometimes second or third cousins, and traced generations through public records. Each branch narrowed the possibilities until, finally, a single name fit both the timeline and the evidence. What once took decades now took weeks. In both Tacoma cases, that process became the bridge between history and justice. Behind those few weeks lay thousands of hours of quiet dedication, by lab analysts, genealogists, and detectives who refused to give up. The impact rippled beyond Washington. Departments nationwide reopened their own forgotten files. Funding for cold case units increased. Families long resigned to silence began to hope again. It was a new era of justice, one in which science could finally bridge the gap time had created. But for Tacoma, the emotion was more complex. Solving the cases didn't erase the pain. The families had endured over 30 years of waiting, of birthdays uncelebrated, of wondering who these men were and why their daughters. Now they had answers, but the answers came with images too terrible to forget. Detective Wade would later say what struck her most was how ordinary the suspects were. "You expect monsters to look like monsters," she said. "But they don't. They look like neighbors, co-workers, people you'd never suspect. What do you think? Is it more terrifying when evil hides behind the ordinary?" Robert Washburn eventually pleaded guilty in 2019 to the murder of Jennifer Bastian. He was sentenced to 27 years in prison, a term he will likely spend the rest of his life serving. In court, Jennifer's mother, Patty, spoke softly but firmly. "You took away my only child," she said. "And for that there are no words. But I hope you know, you didn't win. We still remember Jennifer every day." The courtroom was silent. Washburn offered no response. Gary Hartman's case, however, took a different path. He was initially found competent to stand trial, but subsequent evaluations led to delays and appeals over mental competency. As of 2025, the case remains unresolved. For Michella's family, that waiting continues, not as an absence of justice, but as another chapter in an ordeal that has lasted nearly 4 decades. For the cold case unit, these investigations became proof that time does not protect the guilty. Even decades later, even when memories fade and witnesses move away, the truth remains written in the smallest fragments, in a single cell, a single strand of DNA. The story of Michella Welch and Jennifer Bastian reshaped how cold cases are pursued nationwide. It showed that persistence, paired with compassion, could bring light to the darkest corners of history. Today, Tacoma's parks are different. There are memorial benches near the trails, flowers that appear each year near the old bridges and playgrounds. Visitors may not all know the full story, but those who lived through 1986 never forgot. When the wind moves through the trees at Puget Park or Point Defiance, it carries a kind of quiet remembrance, a promise kept through time. Detective Wade retired in 2018, just months after the arrests. When asked how she felt about leaving the force after solving the cases that had defined her career, she said, "It felt like the right time. Those girls can rest now. And so can I." She left behind a legacy not only of investigation, but of belief that no case is truly cold, only waiting. The advances that solved the Tacoma cases continue to evolve. Genetic genealogy has now solved hundreds of murders and identifications across the country. Yet it all circles back to the same principle that guided those detectives in 1986. Every victim deserves to be found, and every truth deserves to be known. In the end, it wasn't just the power of science that brought resolution. It was human determination. The patience of families, the diligence of investigators, and the courage of those willing to revisit the pain of the past in search of answers. And as the credits of this story fade, the message remains clear. For Michella, for Jennifer, and for countless others still waiting in the archives of America's unsolved cases. Time may pass, memories may fade, but justice, no matter how long delayed, is never out of reach. The years that followed the arrests of Robert Washburn and Gary Charles Hartman carried a strange stillness over Tacoma. For decades, the city had lived with an open wound, 2 little girls taken in the same summer, their names whispered in classrooms, parks, and family kitchens. When the truth at last surfaced, when both killers were unmasked, the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was reflection. Because how do you begin to heal from something that defined a generation? In the early days after the announcements, people came to Puget Park and Point Defiance Park not to mourn, but to remember. Parents who had once clutched their children's hands tighter in 1986 now came with grandchildren, leaving flowers and notes beneath the trees. Joggers stopped to touch the memorial benches, tracing the carved names of Michella Welch and Jennifer Bastian with quiet reverence. For Tacoma, those parks would never again be ordinary. They had become sacred spaces, places where innocence had been stolen, and where, decades later, courage had returned. Local news outlets revisited the story, replaying old footage of candlelight vigils, grainy police sketches, and interviews with detectives who had long since retired. The men and women who had worked the cases in their early years, now gray-haired and slower in step, spoke with visible emotion. One detective said softly to a reporter, "We used to come in every morning and see their photos on the board. Even when other cases came and went, those two never left. You don't close something like that, you just wait for the right moment to finish it." That moment had come. And it had come through science few could have imagined in 1986. The Washington State Patrol Crime Lab became a quiet epicenter of modern justice. Technicians who had once been teenagers when the girls vanished now stood in the same lab where their evidence was tested, realizing they had become part of the story they'd grown up hearing about. Inside sterile rooms lit by cool fluorescent light, DNA samples once thought too degraded were given new life through technology like next-generation sequencing, a method that can analyze even the most fragile fragments. Every strand, every cell, every molecule held the power to rewrite history. And it wasn't just Tacoma. The breakthroughs in the Welch and Bastian cases sent a ripple through the nation's law enforcement community. Agencies from coast to coast took notice. Small-town detectives, cold case units, and forensic scientists began to look at their own dusty evidence boxes differently. If Tacoma could find answers after 30 years, maybe they could too. Within months of those arrests, cold cases across the United States began to stir. Names long forgotten resurfaced in headlines. Families who had resigned themselves to never knowing suddenly received phone calls that began with, "We think we found something." Forensic genealogy became more than a buzzword, it became a bridge between generations. It wasn't just about science, it was about connection. Each DNA strand was a thread linking the present to the past, a reminder that our identities, our families, our histories, are all intertwined. When used with care and respect, that connection could restore names to the nameless, voices to the voiceless. Yet it also raised questions, about privacy, consent, and how far society should go in the pursuit of truth. Lawmakers and scientists began to debate the ethics of using consumer DNA databases for criminal cases. But in Tacoma, no one doubted the purpose. Every advance came with a reminder. Behind every sequence of numbers and alleles was a story waiting to be told. Detectives didn't see DNA as magic. They saw it as a tool, one that required diligence, compassion, and humility. Behind every strand was a person, and behind every person was a story. With Washburn behind bars for Michella's murder and Hartman still facing ongoing competency proceedings in Jennifer's case, Tacoma found itself living between justice served and justice pending. But for the first time in over 3 decades, there was no more uncertainty, only the slow, steady rhythm of healing. In classrooms across Washington, teachers began using Michella and Jennifer's stories and lessons about forensic science and criminal justice. Students who hadn't been born when the girls were taken listened with wide eyes as they learned how persistence, technology, and hope could bring resolution to even the coldest of cases. A new generation was growing up not in fear but in faith, faith that truth, no matter how deeply buried, could still be found. Local police academies added cold case units to their curriculum, training recruits not only in forensic methods but in empathy. In one lecture, an instructor held up a case file and said, "This isn't just paper. It's someone's life waiting to be heard again." For the families, justice was never about headlines or trials. It was about remembrance. The Welch family described feeling both gratitude and sorrow. Gratitude that the world had finally seen Michella's case solved, sorrow that the answers came so late. Jennifer's parents, despite the long legal delays in Hartman's proceedings, spoke with grace. They said knowing who had done it lifted a weight, even if the court's final words hadn't yet been spoken. Their pain didn't vanish, but it transformed. It became purpose. They began advocating for other families of missing and murdered children, attending community events and speaking about the power of perseverance. In one interview, Jennifer's mother said, "You never know when the call will come. We waited 32 years. Don't stop waiting. Don't stop believing that someone, somewhere, is still working." The Tacoma Police Department, inspired by the case's resolution, expanded its cold case program. They began systematically retesting evidence from the 1970s through the 1990s, partnering with state and national labs to identify new leads. The cases that followed might not have been as famous, but they mattered just as much, each one a piece of the same mosaic of justice that Michella and Jennifer had helped shape. And across the country, in places like Colorado, Florida, and Pennsylvania, detectives began whispering a new kind of hope in their precinct halls. "Let's send it for genealogy testing." That single phrase became the modern equivalent of reopening a door long thought sealed. Yet, amid all the technological triumph, something quieter endured, the human side of the story. The parents who still kept their daughters' bedrooms the same. The investigators who carried those case files through every promotion and transfer. The forensic analysts who cried in sterile labs when the computer finally produced a match. Behind every statistic was a heartbeat, and behind every breakthrough was a promise kept. In one televised interview, a retired detective, his badge long since retired, his voice gravelly with emotion, said something that captured it all. "Science gave us the answer. But love is what made us keep looking." The legacy of the 1986 Tacoma Park murders is not just about 2 killers brought to justice. It's about what happens when a community refuses to let go, when families keep faith through silence, and when science becomes the voice for those who can no longer speak. In those quiet parks, where the laughter of 2 young girls once filled the air, there are now signs that read, "In loving memory." Each spring, the flowers bloom again, and the sunlight filters through the trees in the same gentle way it did in 1986. And though time has moved on, it hasn't erased, it's remembered. Do you think advancements in technology like forensic genealogy will one day solve every cold case? Or will there always be mysteries beyond our reach? Share your thoughts below. The story of Michella Welch and Jennifer Bastian reminds us of something timeless, that truth doesn't vanish. It waits. It hides in the fibers of a shirt, the trace beneath a fingernail, the quiet persistence of people who refuse to stop asking why. And when the moment finally comes, when science, memory, and courage align, even whispers can become justice. If this story moved you, and you believe every unsolved case deserves its day of reckoning, consider subscribing to the Cold Case Archive. Here we remember the forgotten, trace the untold, and remind the world that time may fade, but justice endures.